Olivia Hayes had never thought a work trip could feel this heavy. But that winter night in Vancouver carried a weight she couldn't ignore. She arrived at the Harborline Hotel just after sunset, dragging her suitcase behind her as the cold wind pushed against her coat. Travel had always been part of her life. But lately, it felt less like adventure and more like running, though she didn't know from what. She checked in, thanked the woman at the desk, took the elevator up to the 7th floor, and stepped into her room hoping for warmth and quiet. Instead, the heater rattled like an old engine and blew only cold air. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried to shake off the strange emptiness that had settled inside her. Her eyes landed on the phone on the nightstand. She didn't want to call the front desk. She didn't want to sound difficult or needy. But the room was freezing, and the idea of sleeping in a coat was too much. Finally, after pacing for almost 10 minutes, she picked up the phone and dialed. "Front desk, this is Evan," a warm male voice said. Olivia hesitated. Something about his tone made her feel exposed. Not judged, just heard. She explained the issue quickly, trying to hide the cold shakiness in her voice. She expected him to say he'd send maintenance. But instead he paused and spoke with surprising kindness. "I'll come check it myself," he said. "Just give me a few minutes." She stared at the phone after hanging up, wondering why her chest felt tight. She sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing her hands together to warm them. She didn't know who this Evan was, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that she wasn't used to people sounding concerned when she spoke. Not lately. About 10 minutes later, a soft knock echoed through the room. Olivia stood, brushing her hair back nervously before opening the door to her surprise. Two people stood in the hallway, Evan around, early 30s, kind eyes, short brown hair, slightly nervous posture as if he wasn't used to standing this close to guests, and beside him, Grace, the night manager, taller, calm, elegant in a quiet way. Her dark hair pulled into a neat bun. She held a small toolkit and offered Olivia a warm smile. "We both came to help," Grace said gently. "Your call sounded a little stressed. We just wanted to check on you." For a moment, Olivia didn't know what to say. She hadn't thought her voice had revealed anything. But something inside her softened. People rarely noticed her emotions, let alone cared enough to come in pairs. Evan stepped inside and knelt in front of the heater. Grace lingered near the doorway but kept her attention on Olivia. "Long day?" Grace asked. "Long year," Olivia admitted before she could catch the words. Grace's expression shifted to understanding. It's almost like she recognized a type of tiredness she had felt herself. That small moment made something inside Olivia loosen. Like a knot finally letting go. Evan worked quietly, tapping the heater, adjusting a switch, listening closely. He had an earnestness about him, like he truly wanted to fix not just the machine but the whole atmosphere of the room. When the heater suddenly clicked and hummed to life, he looked up with a proud smile. The warm air hadn't even started yet, but the smile alone felt like a small comfort. "There," he said, standing. "It should warm up in a few minutes." Grace nodded and added, "If it stops again, just call. We're both on shift tonight." The way she said both made Olivia wonder why they came together in the first place. It felt more intentional than coincidence. She wasn't used to people looking at her like they wanted to help, not out of duty, but because they cared. It was strange, unexpected, and almost too gentle. Evan hesitated before leaving as if he wanted to say something else. "And don't worry about calling late," he said softly. "You're not bothering us." Grace glanced at him with a knowing smile, and Olivia felt heat rush to her cheeks. Not romantic heat, just human warmth, something she'd been missing for far too long. They stepped out. Olivia closed the door slowly, leaning her forehead against it. She had traveled for years, stayed in countless hotels, met hundreds of strangers. But never once had she felt something like this, two people standing at her doorway, making her feel seen in ways she hadn't expected. She told herself it was just exhaustion, just kindness, just a simple moment of human connection. But as she walked back to the bed, her hands slightly shaking, she knew it was more than that. Something had shifted. Quietly, unexpectedly. She tried to distract herself by unpacking. But every folded shirt reminded her of how many hotels she had lived in, how many nights she had spent alone, how many times she had acted like she didn't care. Eventually, she sat on the bed, staring at the heater as if waiting for it to give her direction. She didn't know it yet, but the night wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The heater hummed strongly at first, then after 20 minutes, flickered. Then flickered again. Olivia closed her eyes. She didn't want to call. She didn't want to seem helpless. She didn't want them to think she was desperate for company even though, deep down, part of her was. She wrapped her blanket around her shoulders, hoping the machine would fix itself. But after a final sputter, it stopped completely. Silence filled the room, and cold air began creeping in again. Olivia stared at the phone for almost a full minute. Her heart raced not from fear, but from something she didn't want to name. She lifted the receiver slowly and pressed the button. Front desk, the familiar voice answered almost instantly. "Olivia, is the heater acting up again?" The way he said her name made her chest tighten. "I'm sorry," she whispered, hating how fragile she sounded. It stopped again. "You don't need to apologize," Evan said softly. "We're coming right now." We dot again. Both dot. Olivia placed the phone down and exhaled, nerves buzzing. 10 minutes later, the knock returned. When she opened the door, the same two faces greeted her. But something about the moment felt heavier, deeper, like the night had pulled them all into the same emotional space as Evan went straight to the heater. Grace walked toward Olivia, holding a warm cup of tea. "You looked cold earlier. I thought this might help." Their fingers brushed as Olivia took the cup, sending a small but undeniable shock through her. Grace noticed her eyes softened. Evan looked over briefly, as if sensing the shift without needing to ask. A silent connection merged between them. Not inappropriate, not romantic in a physical way, but emotional, three people standing in a quiet room, each carrying a different kind of loneliness that somehow recognized the others. Evan fixed the heater again. Grace stayed close to Olivia, her presence steady and grounding. For the first time in months, Olivia didn't feel like she was pretending to be okay, and when they finally prepared to leave, Evan paused at the door. "If you need anything, we're here." Grace nodded. "Even if it's not about the heater." Olivia swallowed hard. She had no words. When the door closed, she sat on the bed, heart trembling in a confusing mix of comfort and longing. She had expected a normal work night. Instead, two strangers had walked into her life in a way she couldn't explain. And as she sat there in the warm, quiet room, she had no idea that the next hour would change everything again, test her heart in ways she wasn't ready for. Because this night wasn't done with her yet. Not even close. Olivia's room had finally warmed up, but she couldn't shake the lingering cold in her chest. The moments with Evan and Grace earlier had left her unsettled in a good way, a way that made her feel alive, but also vulnerable. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders, staring at the soft glow of the heater. It was working now, but something inside her whispered that warmth alone would never be enough. She couldn't stop thinking about them, both of them. How they had arrived together, their concern for her, the way their eyes lingered with understanding. It was confusing, almost thrilling, and terrifying all at once. Time passed slowly. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the heater. Olivia tried to focus on her laptop, work emails, travel plans, anything to distract herself. But each time she typed a sentence, her mind drifted back to the memory of their presence. She remembered Evan's gentle way of checking the heater, Grace's calm, reassuring smile, the way their energy seemed to fill the room in a way she hadn't felt for years. She realized that loneliness wasn't just about being alone, it was about being unseen. And tonight, for the first time in a long while, someone had truly seen her. Then, the heater sputtered. A small flicker of cold air swept through the room. Olivia jumped slightly. She hadn't expected it, and it reminded her that the night wasn't as settled as she had hoped. She debated calling the front desk again. Her first instinct was to tell herself no, to handle it herself. But a part of her, a louder, braver, pardoned their company again. She pressed the phone with trembling fingers and dialed. Front desk, Evan's voice answered, calm and welcoming. Olivia. Is something wrong? Yes. The heater stopped, she admitted softly. Her voice was quiet, almost fragile. And she felt exposed speaking to him. You don't need to apologize, he said immediately. Grace and I will come right away. Don't worry. Her heart skipped. Their willingness to come together again felt overwhelming, almost too much for her emotions to handle. She hung up, leaning against the wall. Moments later, the familiar knock echoed through the room. Olivia's hands shook slightly as she opened the door. There they were, both of them smiling as if arriving at her room. It's the most natural thing in the world. Evan immediately went to the heater, tools in hand, while Grace walked toward Olivia holding another warm cup of tea. Her movement was careful, deliberate, and full of kindness. I thought this might help, she said softly, offering the cup. Their fingers brushed, and a small wave of warmth traveled through Olivia. She noticed that both Evan and Grace seemed aware of these unspoken connections. Evan glanced over at Grace and then at Olivia, and for a split second, all three of them shared a silent acknowledgement of the strange, emotional tension in the room. The heater hummed to life again under Evan's careful hands. Olivia watched them, caught between relief and something more intense. She realized that what she wanted wasn't just a working heater, was their presence, their attentiveness, their care, the fact that they had shown up not once, but twice to make sure she was all right. She felt seen, valued, and for the first time in a long while. She let herself feel something beyond exhaustion and routine. They settled into the room differently this time. Evan crouched near the heater, focused on the task, while Grace sat across from Olivia on a small chair, the cup of tea warming her hands. Olivia took a tentative sip, savoring the heat, the scent, and the comfort of having someone notice her. The silence was easy, almost intimate in a soft, non-romantic way, yet it carried an emotional weight that pulled at her heart, making her feel both safe and exposed at the same time. You don't have to face nights like this alone, Grace said quietly. Her voice was gentle but firm, almost like a promise. I usually do, Olivia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't really let people in. You should, Evan said, standing now and wiping his hands. It's okay to ask for help. It doesn't make you weak. You're allowed to need people. Olivia's chest tightened. Their words weren't just about the heater. They were about life, about her loneliness, about the unspoken fatigue she had carried for months, even years. She realized that this room, these two strangers, the night itself, were forcing her to confront feelings she had buried for far too long. There was something incredibly powerful about being seen without judgment, and she hadn't experienced that in a long time. The conversation moved naturally, flowing between practical concerns and deeper confessions. They didn't press, didn't intrude, but their attention was constant. They asked about her work, her travels, her hometown. Olivia answered hesitantly at first, then with more confidence, finding comfort in the way they listened. Evan shared small stories about his own life, simple things about growing up in Vancouver, small moments that revealed his gentle nature. Grace spoke about the night shifts, about helping guests, and about finding meaning in small acts of kindness. Olivia listened, absorbing everything, and slowly her defenses started to soften. Time passed almost unnoticed. The heater continued to work. The room was warm. And yet Olivia realized that what she truly needed wasn't physical warmth, it was emotional connection. The way they had both come for her, not as colleagues performing a duty, but as people who genuinely cared, had broken through a part of her heart she thought had turned to stone. It was subtle, delicate, a feeling that could easily be missed if she wasn't paying attention, but she noticed it, and she felt it deeply. Eventually, Evan stood and brushed the dust from his hands. Grace gave Olivia a warm, reassuring smile. If tomorrow feels heavy, she said softly, come down to the lobby. We'd like to see you again. Olivia nodded, words failing her. She realized she wanted to accept that invitation, even if it was just to see them again. Even if it was just to feel seen and heard once more. There was a strange comfort in knowing that these people what appeared unexpectedly in her life would be there. Evan added, "We'll both be here." "You're not alone, Olivia." The room seemed lighter now, not because of the heater, but because of the presence they had left behind. Olivia sat on the edge of the bed, hands wrapped around the warm cup of tea, and let herself breathe. She had traveled for work, for life, and yet had never expected a night like this filled with quiet intimacy, understanding, and care. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, not physical, but deeply emotional. She felt a pull toward both of them, a sense of gratitude, longing, and hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She understood, finally, that connection could come in many forms, and that sometimes showing up for someone mattered more than grand gestures or dramatic moments. The night grew deeper. Olivia finally allowed herself to close her eyes, feeling safe in the knowledge that these two people, strangers only hours before, had touched her life in a way she hadn't anticipated. She replayed their voices, their smiles, their small gestures of care. She realized that she hadn't felt truly seen in months, maybe even years. And the sudden intensity of it left her heart both full and tender. As she drifted toward sleep, she thought about tomorrow, the lobby, the chance to see them again, the possibility of a connection that might stretch beyond this cold hotel room. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. Not wildly, not recklessly, but gently, cautiously, with the soft pulse of excitement that accompanies something rare and unexpected. Her last thoughts before sleep carried a quiet promise. She would let herself feel, let herself open up, and perhaps let herself trust that kindness, care, and attention could exist even in places she hadn't expected. That night, the room was warm, but more importantly, her heart was warming too. Ready for a possibility she had almost stopped believing in by the time she finally slept. She understood that calling the front desk had been more than about a broken heater. It had been about opening a door she had kept closed for far too long. And now, with both Evan and Grace in her thoughts, she realized that life sometimes offered connection in the quietest, simplest ways if only one had the courage to answer the door. The night ended with the room quiet, but full in a different way. Warmth lingered in the air, yes, but more importantly, it lingered in Olivia's heart. And she knew when she woke that things would feel different, not dramatically, but meaningfully. Something subtle had shifted. A new possibility had been planted. And for the first time in a long while, she was ready to see where it might lead. The room was no longer just a place to sleep. It had become a space of emotional safety, of gentle discovery, of soft hope. And she knew, somewhere deep inside, that she would carry this night with her its quiet drama, its emotional intensity, its strange, unexpected warmth for a long time. And though the night was over, the story wasn't finished. Tomorrow would bring another chance, another meeting, another step in a delicate journey of connection, trust, and emotional awakening. Olivia drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep, the kind that comes only when one's heart feels touched, if only in small, almost imperceptible ways. The night had delivered more than warmth from a heater. It had delivered a quiet, transformative connection that promised change, understanding, and maybe even the beginnings of something beautifully unexpected.